And I wanted to ask you then, so, I mean, we've spoken now a little bit around like these as non-negotiables. So off the back of that, and if I'm looking at a little bit about leveling up, I mean, what do you think are kind of the big challenges that are facing EX leaders at the moment? I mean, you've spoken about not the same attention or the tone being given to we losing employees, or the examination that goes into that. I mean, what are some of the challenges that you're seeing at the moment that employee experience leaders face in this space?
I would probably start off with understanding what employees want, right? I think if you don't have the tools, the mechanisms to tell you what employees want, it becomes difficult to even start the journey on employee experience. And then I think layer that with trying to find the right balance between organizational needs and what's possible versus what the employee needs. So for me, that's probably one of the first challenges that I've seen in kind of different roles and in my time in the space, is understanding what the employees want, and not based on what I think they want, but actually hearing and providing opportunities, the employees the opportunity and the platform share what they want, so that you can build that and shape that and influence that. I think secondly, I would see having the right tech tools to enable this. So you spoke about Slack a little bit earlier on, but there's so many tools on the go in the workspace. You have Workday, you have Slack, you have Teams, you have Zoom. These are just some of the tools. And I mean, these are just the ones that we use across the board. And you can get, there's integrations into that. There's different layers of technology. You have legacy systems. So making sure you have the right tools that meet everyone's need, but also enable, because we use technology to enable the organization and to enable various things. And I think the fortunate or unfortunate part about technology, it can either enable or become a barrier where you're trying to be agile and move at a certain speed and deliver certain things and create whatever culture it is that you're trying to create. So I think it's important that we spend time from a leadership perspective being clear on what are the tools, on what is the tech that we're going to have in our organization that will enable some of these things that we want and say we are for employees. I think another challenge, and I alluded to a little bit earlier, is how do you implement employee experience in a remote world? How do you drive that collaboration and make sure that communication is consistent? And the Slacks and Teams and Zooms of this world will help. But I think, how do you make sure that I sitting in my house, wherever it is, and somebody else sitting 200 kilometers away, and somebody else sitting in another part of the world, we have a similar employee experience and ultimately a superior employee experience. So I think in a remote world, there is a need to think a little bit harder. And it is challenging to think about, how do I create that experience? And I mean, I'm one of the employees who started my last role during COVID, at the start of COVID. And for me, it was challenging. I managed to, fortunate enough, to pick up the different kind of cultural nuances and the culture of the organization that I work for, managed to build relationships, but it's not as easy for everybody else. I sat at home for the longest time, met my line manager a year later, and it was difficult, but I was able to do it. And I always wonder, and it talks to the idea of inclusion. Is it possible for everyone else? And if we surveyed everybody that started during that time and where they are today and what they've experienced of the organization, would it be the same? So I think that is quite challenging. And you start to see the ramifications of that now when we are meeting face to face and we are a little bit more hybrid. What people think the organization is and what they signed up for and what it actually is might be slightly different, because the experience of coming into an organization or being in an organization in a remote world was different or is difficult. So I do think there's opportunity for us to kind of think a little bit harder around that. And probably the last one I'll talk to is around data. So we talk a lot about data at this point. There's a lot of data out there you can collect, but what I struggle with, and I think what's a challenge, is the insights. and the ability for us to take those insights and translate it into something that can be meaningful and can impact that employee experience. So I think it's how we use the data and what we use the data for that becomes critical, and is probably an opportunity for us as leaders to think a little bit more around that.
Yeah, I think what's interesting there as well is, some of what you're talking to there is, again, if I look at with the customer experience lens, when you're looking at the type of customer that you want in your business, everyone spends a lot of time on that. But, when it comes to mapping employee personas, who do we want in our business? And being intentional about what do those different personas look like, and how do we position our EVP to them? How do we target them? How do we, as you say, be deliberate about that employee experience? It comes down to understanding what all of those different personas need in the different stages of the employee journey, and then using, as you say, your tech to facilitate that. It's not going to silver bullet it. You still have to have the nuances and the personalization attached to those personas, because otherwise it's just a blanket approach, and no employee responds well to that. Then you end up missing everybody instead of,
Exactly. And I think it's important, you raise a very valid point around how in the we could work for the same organization, but we're also different. But at a bare minimum, let's talk to personas and let's talk to our people in a way that is appropriate, because that's how some of the communication gets lost. And I think it's important that, that personalization element is key. But I definitely agree and align to the concept of personas. Yeah,
I mean, I think even, I was chatting, I was speaking at Capitec last week around on the Women's Day event, and we were talking a lot about intersectionality and mental load. And we, one of the things that I was chatting to them about was saying, when we look at how some of our programs are devised in a sort of DEI space, and we look at, and I'm going, the female empowerment piece of that, we're often only looking at one specific type of employee persona there. We're looking at, we're not looking potentially at, women in the organization that have been there for a long time, that are perhaps empty nesters, and how do they come back in and use their skills to reserve and re-energize the organization. We're generally looking at people young in their career advancement. So we've got to look at all our personas and target all of our initiatives to the different personas, because that's how we really get traction,